At first, it was just a faint sound, soft whispers from the walls. But as the days passed, the voices grew clearer. They were no longer just murmurs. They were calling, beckoning, and knowing. Every night they spoke to Marla, and each whisper unveiled more chilling secrets about her house, secrets of an ancient pact, a ghostly child, and a fate she couldn't escape. The voice wasn't just haunting her, it was part of her now. In the walls of her home, the whispers grew louder, demanding something more, something sinister. The house had chosen its vessel. When Marla Fenwick, a dedicated restoration artist, was hired to peel back the layers of wallpaper in a grand manner, she expected to uncover a few dusty secrets. What she didn't anticipate was what lay hidden beneath. The old nursery, once bright with the laughter of children, now stood silent until Marla began her work. As she carefully removed each layer of paper, she discovered more than faded murals. There were symbols, strange and ancient, buried in the walls. But the true horror came when Marla began hearing faint whispers coming from the walls, soft, insistent, and terrifyingly personal. At first, she brushed it off as the usual creaks and groans of an old house. But the whispers were more than just random sounds. They spoke to her, warning her, pleading with her, and revealing horrifying truths about the house's past. Marla was not alone in the nursery. The voice spoke of a stillborn child whose soul was never laid to rest. And the more Marla uncovered, the more she realized. This voice wasn't just a memory. It was something alive, something ancient, and something that wanted more. The whispers grew louder each day, and as she uncovered the final layer of wallpaper, Marla unleashed a force she could never have imagined, a demonic entity tied to the very walls of the manor. Now, Marla must face the consequences of releasing a spirit bound to the house's tragic past, and it's not content to be trapped any longer. As the walls close in around her, Marla realizes she's not just restoring a house, she's fighting for her soul. Story number 1. Ellie Harper had always been the quiet type, even before everything went wrong. As a sound engineer, she found solace in the hums, clicks, and rustles that filled the air, the kind of sounds most people ignored. But after the breakdown, the one that had come like a sudden storm, leaving her shattered and frayed, Ellie needed more than just the muffled world of sound. She needed silence. And that's exactly what the old house in the countryside promised her. It wasn't much, just a small, dilapidated place off the beaten path, hidden among trees that seemed to have forgotten how to shake off the winter chill. Ellie had hoped for peace, a place to hide from the world. Instead, she got a house that had a voice of its own. The first night, Ellie hadn't noticed anything. The house creaked, as old houses tend to do, but on the second night, she heard it, the whispers, barely audible, like the softest crackle on a barely tuned radio. She sat up in bed, straining to listen. It wasn't a trick of the wind, nor was it her tired mind playing tricks. There was something, someone, murmuring from the walls. At first, Ellie assumed it was her nerves. Maybe the isolation was getting to her. But as the days went by, the whispers grew clearer, more distinct. They were faint, fragmented voices, too distant to make out any real words, but there was an urgency to them, a desperation that chilled her bones. It was the sound engineer in her that couldn't let it go. Curiosity consumed her. She took her headphones, her sound recording equipment, and began to capture the whispers. At first, they were sporadic, like random static that couldn't be isolated. But as she studied the recordings, she noticed something strange. There was a pattern. The whispers were there, but they were buried beneath layers of sound, like voices hidden deep within the wood and plaster of the house itself. Days stretched into weeks, Ellie spent every waking hour with her equipment, playing back the recordings, isolating frequencies, and decoding the voices. They started to make sense. Sort of. Words began to emerge, fuzzy and unintelligible at first, but clearer as time went on. Help. Buried. Find us. The voices began to bleed into her thoughts when she wasn't recording, murmuring at the edges of her mind when she sat alone in the kitchen or tried to sleep. The voices started to sound familiar, even comforting. The more she listened, the more it felt like they were speaking to her. One evening, as Ellie sat hunched over her laptop, sorting through hours of sound data, a voice came through, clear and direct. Ellie. Her heart skipped. She hadn't spoken, out loud. The voice had come through the speakers almost like it was coming from the walls themselves. Ellie, you can help us. She froze. Who were they, and how did they know her name? The voice continued, seductive and coaxing. We need you. We need you to listen. Tear down the walls. Ellie felt a shiver run down her spine. It wasn't just a sound anymore. It was something personal, something that had crawled deep into her thoughts. They were calling her, beckoning her. But who were they? She dug deeper, her mind becoming more obsessed with the mystery. She began to piece together the house's history, tracking down old newspaper clippings and talking to locals. That's when she uncovered something truly unsettling. The house had once been a place for scientific experiments, a testing ground for sensory deprivation and mind manipulation. People had disappeared in the house, their bodies never found. It was rumored that some of the tenants had gone mad before they vanished. And then the real horror hit her. Ellie had heard of those experiments before. She'd even been part of one years ago when she was just a teenager. A university project she had volunteered for, eager for some extra cash. She had been subjected to isolation and sensory manipulation, a program designed to push her mind to the brink, to see how far they could stretch the limits of human endurance. At the time, she had thought it was just a study in psychology, harmless and temporary. But now, in the quiet of this house, it all clicked into place. She had been part of it all along, and whatever had happened to those people, whatever had broken them, had followed her here. The whispers were their ghosts, their tortured, fragmented consciousnesses. Ellie's therapist, Marcus, was skeptical when she told him. "You've been under a lot of stress, Ellie," he said, his voice concerned but distant. "I think you need to take a step back. You're not well." But Ellie couldn't stop. The voices in her head, the whispers from the walls, they weren't just random memories. They were instructions. They were telling her what to do. The house wasn't just haunted, it was alive with the remnants of the past, and it needed her to finish what had been started. The whispers had become her obsession. They had become everything to her. It was no longer about decoding the voices. It was about listening, really listening to them. And what they were telling her now was simple. Free us, Ellie. Tear it down. Tear down the walls. On a stormy night, Ellie stood in the center of the house, her mind a blur of desperation and fury. She grabbed a hammer, her hands shaking as she smashed into the walls. Behind the plaster, there was something hidden. But the more she tore at the walls, the louder the voices grew, until they were screaming inside her head. Free us, Ellie. Free us. The final wall came down with a sickening crack, and for a moment, the house fell silent. But then, from the cracks, the whispers rose in a frenzy, faster, louder, overlapping until Ellie's mind couldn't keep up. The room grew colder, darker, as if the very air was pressing in on her, suffocating her. Ellie's last thought before everything went black was that she had finally done it. She had freed them. She had freed herself. The next morning, the house was quiet again. The walls were bare, the floor covered in dust. Ellie was gone. Weeks later, the house was listed for rent again. The real estate agent, Owen, had no trouble finding a new tenant. The house was old, but it had character. Maybe a little eccentricity, sure, but that was nothing unusual. And as the new tenant moved in, the wind rustled through the trees, and the whispers began again. Story number 2. Nate Jensen didn't believe in ghosts. He'd always prided himself on his analytical mind. Nothing in the world that couldn't be explained with science or logic. He was a recent college graduate, freshly independent, with a steady job in a small downtown office building. He had finally moved into his own apartment on the top floor of an old high-rise, a place that promised peace and a new start. It was a cozy one-bedroom, furnished with nothing but the basics, AEE. Couch, a bed, a coffee table, and a stack of books he hadn't quite gotten around to reading yet. The walls were thin, the floors creaked, but that was part of the charm. The place had character, and the rent was cheap, which for a recent grad was more than enough reason to take it. It was on the third night in the apartment that Nate first heard it. He was lying in bed, trying to sleep after a long day, when a soft whisper drifted from the vent. At first he thought it was the wind, or perhaps the pipes. Old buildings like this had a way of groaning at night. But no. This was different. It wasn't random. It was too deliberate. His name. Nate. He sat up, heart pounding. The voice was faint, almost drowned out by the hum of the city outside his window. But it was there, clear enough that his skin prickled. Nate. He turned on the light, casting the room in a harsh glow. He listened, holding his breath. Nothing. Just the low, steady hiss of the air conditioning. He chalked it up to exhaustion. Maybe he was hearing things. Maybe it was just the stress of settling into a new city, a new life. But the next night, it happened again. Nate. It was softer this time, as though the voice was coaxing him, trying to lull him into listening. He sat up in bed, his eyes scanning the dark corners of the apartment. The vent was located above the kitchen, but it seemed to come from all around him, wrapping around him like a whispering presence. He should have ignored it. But something about it felt real. The following evening, when he was sitting on the couch trying to relax with a beer and some takeout, the voice came again, but this time, it wasn't just his name. Nate. Come closer. His stomach twisted. He stood up slowly, walking toward the vent. The building had been built decades ago. He'd heard rumors from other tenants. Nothing concrete, just murmurs of strange noises, things that didn't add up. But who listened to rumors, right? He kneeled in front of the vent, his face inches from the metal grates. He could feel the cold air rushing through, the stale smell of old ductwork, but there was something else now, something he hadn't noticed before. A subtle, vibrating hum deep inside the walls. Nate, we know you. He flinched. The voice was different this time. It was almost as if it had become more familiar, closer. That night, as he lay awake, he tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a neighbor playing a prank, some kids messing around, but deep down he couldn't shake the feeling that it was something more. The next day, when his girlfriend Sarah came over, she noticed the change in him right away. "You look like you haven't slept in days," she said, sitting next to him, on the couch. Nate rubbed his eyes. I'm hearing things." Sarah gave him a concerned look. "Like what?" He hesitated. "Voices, in the vents, at night. It sounds like Someone's whispering my name. Sarah chuckled nervously. It's probably nothing. You know, old buildings. They make weird sounds. But Nate wasn't so sure. The more he listened, the clearer the voices became. They weren't just whispering his name anymore. They were calling to him, inviting him into something he couldn't understand. And then, one night, the voice changed again. She's coming, Nate. She's part of it. He froze, his blood running cold. The voice was referring to Sarah. The thought of her being involved in whatever this was, it unsettled him. He didn't tell her about that part, but he couldn't stop himself from noticing that every time she came over, the whispers grew louder, almost like the voice was feeding off her presence. The more time she spent in the apartment, the more the air around him felt thick with tension, as though the very walls were closing in on him. Then came Mr. Klein, the elderly neighbor who lived across the hall. Nate had seen him a few times, always shuffling around with his walker, but never much of a conversation. One night he knocked on Nate's door, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. "I've heard you," Mr. Klein said, his voice shaking. "The whispers. It's not just you. I thought it was just me, but you've been hearing it too." Nate stared at him, confused. "What are you talking about?" "The voice in the vents," Mr. Klein whispered urgently, his breath coming in short gasps. "It's not just a sound. It's something else. Something that feeds off attention. Once it gets in your head, it doesn't stop. It starts with the whispers, and then it makes you listen. Until you can't think of anything else. It takes you. It takes you, and when it does, you're never the same. Again." Nate felt the weight of Mr. Klein's words settle on him like a fog. But before he could respond, Mr. Klein turned and shuffled back into his apartment, leaving Nate standing there, more terrified than he had ever been. That night, the whispers came again, louder than ever. "Nate!" But now, they didn't sound like strangers. They sounded like his friends, his family, Sarah, his parents, his childhood dog. Their voices echoed in the vents, pleading, urging him to come closer, to listen, and then he realized it. He wasn't just hearing voices. The voices were becoming his loved ones. They were pulling him in, warping his perception, driving him deeper into paranoia. And he couldn't stop it. The voices were everywhere, inside his head, in the walls, in the very air he breathed. Nate stopped sleeping. He spent his days pacing the apartment, muttering to himself. The lines between reality and the whispers blurred. He couldn't tell if the things he was hearing were real anymore. One night, Sarah came over again. She noticed the look in his eyes. Strange, unfocused. He was sitting in front of the vent, staring at it like it was a lifeline. "Nate, please." "Talk to me," she said, her voice trembling. But Nate didn't respond. He was listening. And then, in the dead of night, something broke inside him. The whispers reached their peak, a cacophony of desperate voices, all calling his name. Nate disappeared. The only trace left behind was a recording, a low, distorted voice trapped in the apartment's old recorder. It repeated his name over and over. Nate, Nate, Nate. And from the crawlspace above, the whispers continued, waiting for someone new to listen. Story number 3. Lily Carter had always been the quiet type. At 15, she spent more time with her books and her thoughts than with people. Moving to a new town after the death of her father had only made her more withdrawn. She wasn't sure what she expected from the old Victorian house they'd rented, but it wasn't this. The house was massive, with creaking floors and rooms that felt too big for her and her mother. The wallpaper was peeling, and the air smelled faintly of mildew and dust. Lily hated it. It felt like the house was watching her, its eyes hidden behind cracked windows and thick, musty curtains. Her mother, Mrs. Carter, had tried to make the place feel like home. She painted the walls, rearranged the furniture, and insisted that everything would be okay. But Lily didn't feel okay. Nothing felt okay. She missed her father more than she could ever put into words, and the house, this house, seemed to press that sadness into her chest, making it harder to breathe. It wasn't until the second night in the house that Lily first heard it. She had just settled into bed, the lights dim, the house still and silent, when a faint sound reached her ears. At first, she thought it was the house settling, the creaks and groans that came with its age. But then it came again. A tapping, soft, like a gentle knock. Lily froze. She pulled her blanket tight around her and listened. It came again, louder this time, followed by a whisper. "Hello?" Lily's heart skipped. She didn't move, didn't breathe. She wasn't alone in her room, was she? "Hello?" The voice came again, clearer now, like someone was standing just on the other side of her bedroom wall. The wall. Lily blinked, her pulse racing. The voice was coming from the other side of the room, through the wall. She got out of bed, her feet cold against the floor, and stood near the wall, her ear pressed to it. "Hello?" Lily whispered hesitantly. "I'm Ava," the voice said. "Who are you?" Lily stepped back, a chill creeping up her spine. She had to be hearing things. It wasn't possible. But the voice, soft, yet pleading, felt so real. "I'm Lily," she said, her voice trembling. "Where are you?" "I'm here," Ava answered, as if the question was too simple. "I've been here a long time." Lily's breath caught in her throat. She stood there, listening, not sure what to think. Who was this girl, and why was she talking to her from the walls? Over the next few days, Lily found herself talking to Ava every night. It started as a quiet conversation, just the two of them. Ava asking about Lily's day, Lily talking about her father, the new house, her feelings of loneliness. Ava seemed to understand, her words comforting, like the softest of whispers in the dark. But then, as the days passed, Lily began to notice things. Ava's voice had an eerie quality to it, a hollow echo that seemed to reverberate through the room, even though there was no way she could be on the other side of the wall. And sometimes, when Lily asked about Ava's life, the girl would hesitate, like she was trying to remember things. "Where do you live, Ava?" Lily asked one night, curiosity tugging at her. Ava's voice was quiet, almost uncertain. "I live in the walls. Where else would I be?" Lily frowned. "What do you mean? Are you in the house?" "Yes," Ava replied. "I've always been here. I've always been waiting." The answers started to feel wrong. But Lily didn't stop talking to Ava. She couldn't help it. Ava made her feel less alone, like someone understood her grief, her sadness. But then, things started to get strange. Ava began to demand more attention, her voice becoming more insistent, more urgent. "You should come play with me," Ava would whisper, her tone sweet, but there was an edge to it now, a hidden warning. "We can be together. You don't need anyone else. Just me." Lily's unease grew, but she couldn't stop. She was drawn to the voice in the wall, even though a part of her was scared. One evening, as Lily sat by the wall, her ear pressed to the cold surface, she heard something that made her blood run cold. "I want to be with you, Lily," Ava whispered. "I want to be where you are." Lily jumped back, her heart pounding. She stared at the wall, her skin prickling with a new, sharp sense of fear. "Ava?" Lily whispered. "What do you mean?" "I want you to take my place. Ava's voice replied, softer now, almost pleading. "I want you to stay here with me." The words lingered in the air like smoke, thick and suffocating. Lily's stomach turned. "No," she whispered, stepping back from the wall. "I don't understand." Ava's voice was different now, angry, desperate. "You're not listening," Ava screamed, her voice rising to a fever pitch. "You have to take my place." Lily's heart thudded in her chest. "No, no, I won't." The temperature in the room dropped. Lily's breath came out in sharp, visible puffs. She could feel something shifting in the room, something dark and wrong. Ava was no longer just a voice. She was something else, something desperate. Lily ran to her mother, her footsteps hurried and frantic. "Mom, there's something wrong with the walls," Lily cried. "There's someone in the walls." Mrs. Carter looked at her face pale, her eyes avoiding Lily's. For the first time, Lily saw a flicker of fear in her mother's gaze. "You don't understand," her mother whispered. She's not what you think. She's not a girl. She's something else." Before Lily could respond, there was a knock at the door. Mrs. Carter turned, pale as a ghost. "Mom," Lily asked, "what are you hiding?" Mrs. Carter didn't answer. She turned and left the room without a word, her footsteps quick and unsteady. That night, Lily tried to sleep, but the voice in the wall was louder than ever, its demands growing more frantic. It was as though the walls themselves were alive, pushing in on her from all sides. The next morning, when the neighbors called to check on her, the room was empty. Everything was perfectly clean. No sign of Lily anywhere. But when they inspected the wall, they found scratch marks, deep, desperate claw marks, on the inside of the wall where Lily's bed had been. Lily Carter had vanished. All that remained was the faint sound of whispers in the walls, calling for someone else. The house, with its cold, empty rooms, stood silent once more, waiting for the next person to listen. Story number 4. Michael Rohn didn't believe in ghosts. At 30, freshly divorced and looking for a fresh start, he considered himself a man of reason, of logic. His job as a writer had always kept him grounded in the world of the tangible, the solid, the real. He didn't have time for superstition or paranormal nonsense. And that's why, when he moved into the renovated duplex on Elm Street, he figured it was just the perfect place to begin anew. The building had an old charm to it, something he found oddly comforting. The hardwood floors creaked, the pipes groaned, but it was quiet. Too quiet, some might say, but for Michael, it was a peace he desperately needed. The landlord, Tessa, had been pleasant enough when he signed the lease. She'd mentioned the place had been remodeled after the previous tenant had moved out, or disappeared, as she put it with a half-hearted laugh that Michael thought was a little too forced. "Good luck," Tessa had said when handing him the keys, as if she knew something he didn't. "I'm sure you'll enjoy it here. Just don't mind the old house quirks." But Michael didn't mind the quirks. He had enough of his own to deal with, and a new place was a welcome distraction. It was around 2 weeks after moving in when it started. Michael had been drifting off to sleep, the sound of traffic muffled by the old windows, when it came. A faint whisper from the walls. He was still half awake, too tired to make sense of it, so he pushed it out of his mind. The next night, it came again. And the night after that. At exactly 3:33 a.m., he woke to the sound of whispers, distant but clear. "Let me in." Michael froze, his body stiff with confusion. He rubbed his eyes, thinking it was just a dream, but no. He heard it again. A faint, pleading voice, as if it was coming from somewhere just beyond the wall. "Let me in." His heart pounded in his chest. It couldn't be his downstairs neighbor playing a prank, could it? It was an old house, creaky floors, thin walls. He told himself it was just a trick of the house settling. But there was something unnerving about the exactness of the whisper, the repetition of the phrase. It sounded desperate, almost human. The next morning, he casually asked Tessa if there had been any complaints from the tenant below about noise. "No one's down there," she replied with a slight pause. "That unit's been vacant for years." That struck him. He had no reason to doubt her, but something felt off. He asked, "Why? I thought the place had been renovated." Tessa's expression tightened just a little. It was. But the basement. It's sealed off now. We don't talk about the basement much. Michael didn't push her further. He had other things on his mind. But that night, he found himself lying awake, the words echoing in his head. "Let me in." He knew he had to find out what was going on. So, the next day, he decided to investigate. He made his way down the stairs, his footsteps hesitant on the creaky steps, and approached the door to the basement. It was locked. No surprise there. Tessa had mentioned that the basement was sealed. He ran his fingers over the old wood, tracing the grain. There was no sign of any recent work done on the door. Nothing that suggested a new lock or a fresh coat of paint. He stood there for a long moment, unsure of what to do. Then, with a sharp breath, he reached for the old handle. It wouldn't budge. He knocked on Tessa's door later that afternoon. She was in the middle of cleaning the hallways, wiping down banisters with a cloth. "Is there any way to get into the basement?" Michael asked, trying to keep his voice casual. Tessa paused, her eyes narrowing. "You don't need to go down there." "I was just curious," Michael replied. "I heard something from the unit below. Is there a tenant?" "Down there?" She shook her head slowly. "No. The basement's sealed. No one's been down there in years." Her tone was firm. Too firm. "Then what's causing the noise?" Michael asked. "It's at night, around 3:30 a.m. I keep hearing this whispering. It's like someone's asking to be let in." Tessa's face went pale. For the first time since meeting her, Michael saw her mask of control slip. "It's nothing," she muttered quickly. "Probably just the house settling." Michael wasn't convinced, but he couldn't press her any further. She wasn't giving him anything. So he did what he always did when he was desperate for answers. He started digging. Later that week, he visited Officer Griggs, a cop who lived a few blocks down. The officer was sitting at his desk when Michael knocked on his door. "You look like you've seen a ghost, Roan," Officer Griggs said, noticing the anxious look on Michael's face. "I'm hearing something," Michael confessed. "Whispers. Every night. At exactly 3:33 a.m. The voice is saying, 'Let me in.'" Officer Griggs chuckled. "You sure you're not just hearing things? Maybe it's the pipes or rats. That house is old after all." "I checked the pipes," Michael said. "I'm telling you, this isn't normal." Griggs didn't seem convinced, but when Michael mentioned the sealed-off basement and the old tenant who'd disappeared, the officer raised an eyebrow. "You're serious, huh?" "I am," Michael said. "I think it's coming from the basement. But no one will tell me what happened down there." Officer Griggs rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "I've heard things about that place, about the old tenant who disappeared, but nothing concrete. If you're really hearing something down there, I'd recommend talking to Tessa. She might know more than she's letting on." That night, Michael's dreams started blending with reality. He couldn't separate the two anymore. He woke up with cold sweat on his skin, sure that someone was in his room. In his dream, he was standing in the basement, looking down at the floor. A shape moved beneath the wooden planks. He reached down and the floorboards creaked as if something was trying to break through. When he woke up, the whispers started again. This time, louder, more insistent. "Let me in." His mind was unraveling. the line between the whispers and his own thoughts growing thin. He had to know the truth. He couldn't stop now. Michael broke into the basement that night using a crowbar to pry open the sealed door. The darkness that greeted him sent a chill down his spine. He flicked on his flashlight and walked down the narrow steps, his pulse racing. At the bottom, he found a small room, dusty, neglected. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of decay. He shone the light around, but it landed on something that made his stomach drop. A trapdoor. Michael moved toward it, his hand trembling as he reached for the handle. With a loud creak, he pulled it open. And then, in the darkness beneath the trapdoor, he heard it. Heavy breathing. Shallow, desperate gasps for air. He leaned down, his face inches from the opening, and then, without warning, the trapdoor slammed shut. Everything went silent. The next morning, the landlord found Michael's apartment empty. The door to the basement was locked, and the entire place was eerily still. No sign of struggle, no trace of Michael Rohn. But when Officer Griggs visited, he swore he heard the whispers, faint, desperate, coming from beneath the house. Let me in. Story number 5. The university was old, older than most of the students who walked its wide, polished hallways. It was the kind of place with centuries-old stone buildings, ivy creeping up the sides, and a reputation that stretched back for generations. But for Nina Flores, a 21-year-old audio prodigy, it wasn't the prestige of the place that drew her in, it was the sound. Nina had been obsessed with sound since she was a child. She could hear the smallest detail in a piece of music, the faintest hum from an electrical wire, the almost imperceptible echo in a room. Her friends joked that she had a gift, some kind of sixth sense when it came to audio. She loved it. She thrived on it. And when she was accepted into the university's elite audio engineering program, she thought it was the perfect place to push her talents to their limits. But there was one thing that always seemed to haunt the halls of this prestigious institution: the Whisper Room. The Whisper Room was an abandoned soundproof lab, deep within the bowels of the university. It was a place no one really talked about. Though rumors swirled among the students like a thick fog, no one had used it in decades. Some said it was an experimental space where students used to study auditory phenomena. Others whispered it was the site of strange experiments, ones that involved a sound-based entity that could drive you mad if you listened to it long enough. It was one of those places that people dared each other to visit. Spend the night inside, and you'd be a legend. It was a rite of passage, or so they said. But most students, like the rest of the world, quickly forgot about it. Until Nina overheard a conversation in the student lounge one afternoon. "Lucas, I'm telling you, the Whisper Room isn't just some old lab. People say the sounds you hear in there don't come from the walls or the equipment. They come from something else, something alive." It was Lucas, one of Nina's classmates, speaking in a low voice. He was looking at her, unsure of how to continue, but Nina had heard enough. She couldn't resist. She leaned over and interrupted. "Is it true? Does the room really do that? Does it change the sound?" Lucas looked at her, eyes wide. "You haven't heard about it. Everyone talks about it. Well, everyone who's brave enough to step inside. They say the longer you stay in there, the more real the sound becomes. Like it's not just noise, it's alive. Some students even lost their memories after spending time in there." Nina didn't flinch. She didn't even think twice. "I'll do it," she said, her voice calm, almost eager. Lucas hesitated. "Nina, I'm serious. It's not a joke. People get hurt in there. Mentally, I mean. They lose track of time. Some even forget who they are." Nina laughed. "I'm not afraid of some sound." She wasn't. She'd spent years studying the way sound could affect the mind, how it could shape reality, distort perception. The idea of decoding a sound that wasn't supposed to be there, that was exactly what she wanted. That night, after hours, Nina made her way to the lab with only her notebook and her recorder. The hallway leading to the whisper room was dark, and the air felt thick with something Nina couldn't place. The door creaked when she pushed it open, revealing the room. A blank, sterile space. It looked ordinary at first glance, but Nina knew better. The walls were lined with old soundproofing materials, the kind that had been outdated for years. The equipment was dusty and silent, untouched for decades. She set up her gear, headphones, microphone, recorder, and a notebook. She sat in the center of the room, closed her eyes, and let the silence settle around her. It was so quiet that it felt unnatural, like the world outside was pressing in on her. Then the whispers started. At first, it was just a faint murmur. She couldn't make out the words. She leaned in closer, adjusting the headphones, trying to tune into the sound. The voice was soft at first, but as it grew louder, Nina realized that it wasn't just noise. It was a pattern, a rhythm. She could almost hear it shaping itself, pulling itself into something coherent. "Let me in." The words were so clear now, so distinct. The whisper came again, this time right behind her ear. "Let me in." Nina's heart skipped. She paused the recording, but the whispers didn't stop. They continued, even louder this time, as if they were right in the room with her. "Let me in. Let me in." She turned off the recorder and pulled off the headphones, but the voice didn't fade. It was still there, still inside her head, reverberating like it was part of the air around her. She stood up, pacing, trying to shake the feeling that something was pressing in from all sides. The door slammed shut. Nina spun around, panic bubbling up inside her. She rushed to the door, but it wouldn't budge. The room was soundproof, the walls designed to keep everything inside. There was no way out. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. "Let me in. Let me in. You're mine now." Her hands shook as she fumbled with her equipment, trying to record, trying to capture the sound, the source, but it was all so much. Too much. It wasn't just in her ears anymore. The sound was inside her thoughts. The whispers were no longer separate from her mind. They were her mind. She couldn't tell if she was hearing them or if they were becoming her own thoughts. And then it hit her. The room wasn't just a place to listen. It was a place where the sound changed things. The longer she stayed, the more she felt herself slipping. She could feel the entity, whatever it was, inside her, in her memories. The whispers weren't just saying words anymore. They were rewriting her thoughts, her past. "Let me in." The voice felt familiar now. It was no longer just a whisper. It was a presence, something ancient, something that had existed long before Nina set foot in the room. She couldn't remember the last time she'd spoken aloud. She couldn't remember when the whispers had stopped sounding like words and had become something else. The longer she stayed in the room, the more she lost of herself, her identity. Her name felt strange. Her memories were fading, like someone had taken a pencil and erased the edges of them, leaving behind only blurry shapes. Nina had no idea how much time had passed. Hours? Days? It didn't matter anymore. All that mattered was the voice, and it was growing stronger. "You're mine now," the voice whispered. It was no longer an entity. It was Nina. She was speaking the words, but she wasn't sure if it was her speaking at all. The door creaked open. She walked out. But something was different. Nina smiled, her lips stretched wide, her face glowing, but there was nothing in her eyes. The last trace of the old Nina was gone. As she walked out of the whisper room, the last thing she heard was a faint whisper. "Let me in." And Nina smiled again. It wasn't her smile anymore. It was something else. Something that had come from the room. The whisper entity now spoke through her. Story number 6. Laura. Belle had always been a fighter, but grief has a way of turning even the strongest person into someone unrecognizable. When her husband, Daniel, passed away suddenly, she didn't know how to cope. He'd been everything to her. Her partner, her support, the father of her son, Tommy. And now he was gone. Tommy was just 6, but he felt older somehow. He had his father's eyes and his quiet, thoughtful nature. He didn't cry much when Daniel died, and Laura was both relieved and worried about it. Tommy had always been a little different, a little too good at keeping his feelings hidden. She thought maybe that was a sign of strength, but sometimes it made her worry. They moved into a small house in a quiet neighborhood, hoping the change of scenery would help them heal. The house was old, but it was comfortable, with a cozy living room and a small yard for Tommy to play in. Laura didn't mind the creaking floors or the strange noises at night. They felt normal, like the house was just settling. But then Tommy started talking about the voice. At first, Laura thought it was just his imagination. He was a creative kid, always talking to himself, pretending his toys had lives of their own. She'd listen from the other room, and Tommy's voice would be high-pitched, excited, as if he was telling someone a secret. "Who are you talking to, Tommy?" she'd ask, poking her head into his room. "Oh, it's just my friend," he'd say, grinning. "He's in the wall." Laura thought it was odd, but kids often had imaginary friends, didn't they? She let it slide, thinking it was just part of the grieving process. But over time, she started to notice something strange. The voice Tommy was talking to seemed different. Sometimes when he'd answer, he'd pause before speaking, like he was listening to someone first. He would say things that didn't make sense, things a 6-year-old shouldn't know. It started with little things, like how he knew exactly how his father had died, or how he could describe the neighbor's house without ever having been inside it. Laura tried not to panic, but the unease crept in, making her feel like something was wrong. One night, after Tommy had been talking to his friend in the wall for hours, Laura finally had enough. She marched into his room, determined to put an end to it. "Tommy, stop talking to the wall," she said sternly. "It's just your imagination." But Tommy's face darkened, and for the first time she saw a flicker of something not quite right in his eyes. "He doesn't like when you say that," Tommy said softly. "He says I should talk to him. He gets upset if I don't." Laura's stomach tightened. "Who gets upset, Tommy?" "The voice," he said, almost matter-of-factly. He said, "You should never say that. Or else." "Or else what?" Tommy looked at her blankly. "I don't know, but he said I shouldn't say anything to you anymore." Laura felt a chill run down her spine. She'd heard enough ghost stories to know this wasn't right. She wasn't sure what was going on, but she needed help. She needed to understand what had been going on in this house before they'd moved. The next morning, Laura went to see Pastor Rourke, a local minister who had been a friend of the family for years. He was a kind man, with a gentle smile and eyes that had seen too much. When she explained what was happening with Tommy, his face turned serious. "You've heard the stories about this house, haven't you?" Pastor Rourke asked. Laura shook her head. "I know it's old, but I thought it was just a house, you know? We just needed a fresh start." The pastor sighed as if he had been expecting this. "This house has a history, Laura. A dark one. A long time ago, a man named Isaac Granger lived here. He was known for being a quiet man, a good neighbor, but he had a secret. Isaac Granger was a serial killer. He killed children, and it's said that the spirits of his victims are still trapped here, especially the spirit of one of them, the voice your son is hearing." Laura's blood ran cold. "You're saying it's Isaac Granger's ghost?" "The killer." Pastor Rourke nodded. "Isaac died in this house, right here years ago. But his spirit didn't leave. It's been feeding on the grief, on the loneliness. And now it's found your son. It wants to control him." Laura's hands shook as she tried to absorb the information. "What do I do?" "You need to stop Tommy from listening to the voice. The longer he listens, the stronger it gets. It will start to influence his thoughts, his actions. It will make him do things." That night, Tommy was quiet. He didn't talk to the voice, in the walls, but Laura could hear him whispering softly in his sleep. When she checked on him, he was muttering, almost like he was having a conversation with someone. "What's wrong, Tommy?" she asked gently, sitting on the edge of his bed. He didn't wake up, but his lips kept moving. "I'm sorry. I have to do it." He said, "I have to." The next day, Tommy started repeating things he shouldn't know. He would whisper under his breath things that made Laura's blood run cold. "The neighbor's dog is going to die today," or "Mommy will be sad, but it's not my fault." And then it happened. Tommy walked into the kitchen holding a knife, his small fingers curled around the handle. His face was blank, like he wasn't really there, like he was being controlled by something else. Laura's heart pounded in her chest as she screamed at him to drop it, but Tommy only looked at her with vacant eyes and repeated the voice's words. "He said you have to stop talking to me," Tommy said, his voice distant. "He said I have to hurt you if you don't." Laura rushed to grab the knife from him, but the look on his face, empty, cold, made her recoil. She couldn't lose him. She couldn't let the voice have him. That's when she made the hardest decision of her life. She ran out of the house, leaving Tommy behind for a moment, and came back with a gas can. She'd learned enough from Pastor Rourke to know what she had to do. The house had to burn. It was the only way to destroy the presence inside. Tommy screamed as the flames began to consume the house. He cried for help, but Laura couldn't stop. She could feel the house fighting back, the whispers trying to reach her, trying to call Tommy back, but she didn't listen. She couldn't. The house burned to the ground. Tommy survived. He was found sitting in the ruins, staring blankly ahead, as if he'd been lost somewhere in time. But when Laura asked him what happened, he didn't remember. I just talked to the voice," Tommy said quietly. "But it's gone. Now, isn't it?" Laura hugged him tightly, tears filling her eyes. But as she looked at her son, she heard it. Soft, so soft, that whisper in the back of her mind. It was Tommy's voice, but it wasn't Tommy. "I'm still here, Mommy," it whispered in the silence. "I'm still here." And sometimes at night when Tommy sleeps, Laura hears the whispers again. Story number 7. Liz had always loved the idea of a fixer-upper. There was something about the thought of taking an old neglected house and transforming it into a home that spoke to her creative side. So, when she and Aaron found the Echo House, a dilapidated 2-story nestled on the edge of town, it felt like fate. It was perfect. Or so they thought. The house had been abandoned for years, its paint chipped and its windows cracked. But the bones were good. Liz could already see the new life she could breathe into the place, the warm colors for the walls, the open spaces, the fresh touches. It was everything she dreamed of. And Aaron, her logical, no-nonsense husband, was on board too. He was a computer programmer, pragmatic, always thinking things through, the kind of guy who believed in facts and explanations. But something felt off the moment they moved in. The first night, as they lay in their bed in the master bedroom, the house groaned, like it was shifting, settling. Liz was used to old houses making noises, but this was different. The sound came from the walls, a soft, muffled murmur, like whispers just out of earshot. "Did you hear that?" Liz whispered, sitting up. Aaron shifted beside her. "Probably just the plumbing. You know how these old houses are?" Liz nodded, trying to shake the uneasy feeling. The house was old, yes, and it had been empty for a long time. But still, there was something about the whispers that didn't sit right. The next day, as they started working on the kitchen, the sounds continued. At first, it was just occasional, like someone was talking in another room. But then the whispers started to form words. Liz swore she heard her name. Liz! She spun around, but the room was empty. Aaron was at the counter, hammering away at a shelf. "It's nothing," he said when she looked at him, his voice a little more terse than usual. He was practical, but she knew Aaron well enough to know he was starting to feel it too, the growing sense of discomfort that had started to settle into their bones. It wasn't just the whispers anymore. The house felt alive. Liz couldn't explain it. The way the walls seemed to pulse, the way the floorboards creaked louder than they should, the way the air in certain rooms felt thick, like it was pressing against her. But still, they pressed on. They had to. They couldn't back out now. Weeks went by, and the house became a labyrinth of renovations, dust, and half-painted walls. But then the whispers grew louder, more insistent. One night, as they sat in the living room, a voice came from the walls, as clear as day. "You're going to slip," it whispered, sending a chill down Liz's spine. Liz looked at Aaron, who hadn't heard it, but she felt it, a warning. The next morning, she slipped on the stairs while carrying a box, twisting her ankle badly. "Just a coincidence," Aaron said, helping her to the couch. But the unease was growing in him too. The house had started to wear on both of them, and the voice kept speaking. Always with little things at first, things that were unsettling but could be explained away. A misplaced tool, a door left ajar, the light flickering in the hallway. Then came the more disturbing things. One evening, while Liz was out running errands, the voice told Aaron something that made him freeze in his tracks. "You'll hurt yourself with a hammer," the voice said. He laughed it off, but when he returned to the house, he picked up a hammer to fix a loose nail and it slipped, striking him hard on the hand. "Maybe I just need some rest," he muttered, rubbing his sore fingers. But the house wasn't done yet. It began to predict things. Real things. Liz's hand would scrape the wall as she worked on a project, and the voice would whisper, "Watch out for the glass." Moments later, she'd accidentally knock over a glass jar, and it would shatter. At first, it was small accidents. Then it started predicting worse things, worse events. Liz's friend Janice, who lived down the street, warned her one afternoon, when they were talking over tea. "You know, they say no couple who lives in that house ever leaves it," Janice said, her voice low. "They say it feeds on your energy, your love. The house, it takes it." Liz brushed it off, laughing nervously, but the seed had been planted. What was happening to them? Was it really just old pipes, old wood, and old nerves? Or was there something more? One night, as Liz stood alone in the kitchen, she heard the voice again. This time, it was more sinister. "You're not leaving. You belong here." She froze. "What do you mean?" she whispered to the walls, half afraid to ask, and then it said with a chilling finality, "One of you will stay. One of you will leave." Liz's blood ran cold. She wasn't sure what it meant. Who would stay? Who would leave? The next few days were a blur of tension and uncertainty. Aaron's behavior started to change. He grew more distant, more irritable. He wouldn't sleep. He wouldn't eat. His eyes started to look hollow, haunted, like he was hearing things Liz couldn't hear. The whispers in the walls had become louder for him, too. It wasn't just the voice now. The house was alive. It was pressing in on them, warping their thoughts, creating illusions to tear them apart. Liz could see it in Aaron's face. He wasn't the man she had married. The house had its hooks in him. It wanted him, needed him, and then, one night, it happened. The voice spoke to Liz in a way that was different from the others. This time, it wasn't a whisper. It was a scream. He's the one. Aaron had lost it. He'd snapped. In a wild frenzy, he attacked Liz, shouting that she was trying to leave him, that she wasn't going to take him away from the house. The rage in his eyes wasn't Aaron anymore. It was something else, something the house had made of him. Liz fought back, struggling, but the house, Echo House, had chosen. It had selected him. In the chaos, as she managed to get away, Liz could hear the voice laughing in the walls, deep and hollow. It was as if the house was alive, celebrating its victory. But as she fled the house, she saw Aaron standing at the door, staring at her with empty eyes. "Please," he whispered, "please don't leave." But Liz couldn't stay. She couldn't be a part of this any longer. She fled. But as she drove away, her hands shaking on the wheel, she heard it, a soft, familiar whisper. "You'll come back," the voice said from the back seat. Liz turned around, but there was no one there. Only the empty, hollow sound of the house calling her back. And Aaron, in the rearview mirror, was still there, his face pressed to the glass. The house had won. Story number 8. Calvin Rhodes had always been the voice of the night. His late-night radio show was a staple of the local airwaves, a place where the lonely and restless could find comfort in his deep, gravelly voice. At 42, he'd been doing it for years. Too many years, maybe. The novelty had worn off, and now it was just a job. But he was good at it. He knew how to connect with the listeners, how to lull them into a sense of familiarity with his stories, his music, his easy banter. But lately, something had been changing. Something he couldn't quite explain. It started small, just an odd flicker of static, a barely perceptible buzz on the airwaves. Calvin brushed it off at first. Old equipment, worn-out wires, maybe even just a storm passing through. But as the weeks went by, it got worse. The static started to grow. Then, one night, he heard it. Whispers, faint at first, barely audible over the music. He thought it was a prank at first. Maybe someone had hacked into the feed, trying to mess with him. But when he checked the equipment, everything seemed fine. The whispers didn't stop. Calvin tried to ignore it. He focused on his show, keeping the conversation light, as he always did. But as the nights passed, the whispers grew clearer, and that's when he realized something far more disturbing. The whispers weren't random. They were words. They were sentences. And they were speaking directly to him. "Help me." It was a soft voice, faint and distorted like it was coming from the farthest reaches of space. Calvin glanced over at the soundboard. Nothing, but the voice came again. "Help me, before it's too late." It wasn't part of the broadcast. It was coming from the static, from somewhere deep within the frequency itself. Calvin's stomach churned, but he kept talking, trying to play it off. His listeners didn't seem to notice, so he didn't mention it. But it kept happening, night after night. The whispers became more frequent, more detailed, more insistent. He couldn't ignore it anymore. On the third night, as he listened to the static hiss, trying to decipher the whispers, a chilling thought crossed his mind. What if these weren't just random noises? What if they were messages? Messages about real events? He leaned closer to the mic, trying to make sense of the distorted words. Oh, we'll die tonight. Alleyway. Black car. Calvin's heart skipped. It sounded like a prediction, a warning, a murder. His mind raced. Could it be? Was it a coincidence? Or was it something more? Something darker? The next day, Calvin did what any person would do when they were given a warning like that. He tried to stop it. He called the police, but they didn't take him seriously. It's just static, they told him. It's probably some kind of interference. But Calvin wasn't convinced. He could feel it. Something was happening. He could hear the truth in the whispers, hear the fear in the voice. He started to obsess over the whispers, spending his days decoding the static. The voice grew clearer with each night. She'll die at 2 a.m. The alley behind Vinny's Pizza. It was always the same. Detailed, real-time descriptions of crimes before they happened. Calvin began to track them. He'd call the police, give them the details from the whispers, but every time, the events played out exactly as the voice described. The murder happened. The victim died. One night, as Calvin listened, his hands trembling, he heard the voice again. But this time, it was different. It was calmer, colder. "Do you want to stop it?" the voice asked. Calvin froze. He stared at the soundboard, his breath caught in his chest. This wasn't a random message anymore. It was like the voice was talking to him directly to him. "Stop it. Save them," Calvin said aloud, almost against his will. But the voice didn't stop. Instead, it grew louder, more insistent. The whispers now were like a chorus, all around him, pulling him deeper into the madness. They started describing not just the crimes, but his involvement. "You're the one who kills them." Calvin's mind went blank. His heart raced. His head spun. Could it be? Was he the one committing these murders? He had no memory of it, no recollection. But as he listened to the whispers, they began to paint a disturbing picture. One where he was the murderer. Stop him. He's the killer. And just like that, he knew. The voice. It wasn't just warning him. It was guiding him. It wasn't coming from some outside source. It was coming from him. Another version of himself. A Calvin from another timeline. One where he'd embraced the darkness. One where he'd been driven mad by the voice. That Calvin had been the killer. "Do you want to stop it?" the voice repeated. But now it was mocking him, dripping with malice. "It's too late. You're already doing it. You are it." Calvin couldn't escape the truth. He was trapped, spiraling into madness. He had been the killer in another life, and now that version of himself was talking to him, guiding him, urging him to repeat the crimes. The more he tried to stop it, the more the murders played out exactly as he tried to prevent them. It was as if every effort to change the outcome only made it worse. In a final desperate move, Calvin took himself off air. He couldn't stay on the station anymore. He couldn't keep listening to the voice, the whispers that were now embedded in his mind. But when he thought he was free, when he thought he could escape the madness, the whispers followed him. He wasn't the static anymore. It was the walls of his apartment. Host. The word was clear, sharp, calling him from inside the walls. Calvin spun around, panic surging through him. He was alone. No one else was in the apartment. But the voice that had once been just static, now was everywhere. He couldn't run. He couldn't escape. Host. Calvin shuddered. His hand gripped the edge of the counter as he realized the truth. The voice wasn't just in his head anymore. It was his head. It was his own twisted reflection, a dark version of himself, telling him what to do, what he had already done. He couldn't stop it. Not in this world. Not in any world. And as the whispers grew louder, Calvin Rhodes realized there was no escape from the static. He had become a part of it, a part of the voice, a part of the cycle, forever. Host. Story number 9. Marla Fenwick was a woman who found peace in the past. As a restoration artist, she had dedicated her life to peeling back layers of history, uncovering forgotten stories hidden beneath layers of dust and paint. She worked with precision, finding beauty in the most neglected of spaces. But when she was hired to restore the Grand Manor on Ashford Hill, she could never have predicted the horrors that would be uncovered. The manor was magnificent, towering over the surrounding countryside like something from another time. It was beautiful, but there was an unsettling energy that seemed to cling to its very walls, as though the house itself held on to secrets. The owner, an eccentric old woman named Clarissa, had inherited it from her late husband, and now it was falling apart. The wallpaper, faded, peeling, and moth-eaten, was one of the worst offenders. Clarissa hired Marla to strip it all away and reveal the original murals hidden beneath. "Be careful," Clarissa had warned her, standing in the doorway, her hands wringing the hem of her cardigan. "My husband always said the house had a history. I never understood it, but he was always cautious about certain rooms, certain walls." Marla nodded. She had heard stories like that before. Old houses with creepy legends, those were the places she loved to restore. She wasn't superstitious, not like Clarissa. History was history, and Marla was just there to bring it back to life. The first day she began peeling the wallpaper was nothing out of the ordinary. The old glue came away easily enough, and beneath it, the murals began to reveal themselves. But the deeper she went, the more strange it became. The colors were rich, vibrant, despite years of neglect. There were symbols Marla didn't recognize, arcane patterns, swirling shapes, and faces she couldn't quite place. She had worked on many restoration projects, but these murals felt different. They seemed too alive. The first time she heard the whispers, it was so soft she thought it was just the wind. But by the second night, when she sat alone in the room, stripping the final layer of wallpaper, she realized it wasn't the wind at all. Leave it alone. The voice was barely more than a murmur, barely audible over the sound of her knife, scraping against the paper. She froze, looking around the room, but no one was there. The old house creaked, settling under the weight of time, but the voice lingered in her ears, echoing in her mind. She tried to shake it off. It was probably her imagination, or the house settling, or maybe even the remnants of some old electrical wire buzzing in the walls. But the next day, as she continued working, the whispers came again. "Stop. Don't touch the final layer." Marla ignored it, assuming it was just fatigue playing tricks on her. But as the days passed, the whispers grew more urgent. They were no longer soft murmurs. Now they were clear, distinct, like voices calling out to her. And they weren't just warnings. They were descriptions. "You'll see the truth soon. We are bound here." The murals, the symbols, they were like a map, a guide. As Marla worked, she began to see more than just paint. Visions started flooding her mind. Flashes of the house's past. She saw shadowy figures gathered in the parlor, their hands raised in ritualistic gestures. A seance. A woman with hollow eyes, chanting something in a language that felt old, ancient even. Then she saw more. A man's face, twisted with pain, his hands bound, his body covered in blood. She saw the walls, the murals, the symbols. They weren't just art. They were seals, imprisoning something. Something dark, something hungry. The deeper she went, the more she saw. The house was a prison, a trap. And as she removed the last layer of wallpaper, she realized that the murals had been keeping something locked away. Something that had been tied to the house's original owner, an unholy pact, a deal made with a demonic entity long ago. The voices came again, louder this time. Don't remove it. You're breaking the seal. You're letting it out. Marla's hands shook as she hesitated, the final layer of wallpaper half peeled back. But the voices were so insistent, their tone growing desperate. Please, you don't understand. It's not what you think. But it was too late. Her curiosity, her obsession with the restoration, had driven her to this point. She had to see what was behind the wall. She had to know the truth. With one final tug, the last piece of wallpaper came away. The room grew colder, and then the house screamed. It wasn't a loud noise, but it reverberated through the walls, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The air grew thick, and the temperature dropped as the walls seemed to groan in agony. And then the entity, no longer confined to the murals, came alive. Marla staggered back, her heart pounding in her chest. She saw it then, in the corners of her vision. It wasn't a physical form at first. It was more like a shadow, a presence, swirling and shifting. But it was there, in the room with her, touching her thoughts, whispering to her. "You freed me," it said, its voice low, honeyed, full of malice. "And now you belong to me." She tried to scream, but the sound caught in her throat. Her vision blurred and she fell to her knees. The whispers wrapped around her mind, coiling like a serpent. She was no longer in control. She could feel the weight of the entity pressing against her, filling her head with images. Visions of pain, of blood, of the original owner's pact. The house had not just imprisoned the demon, it had fed it. And now that the seal was broken, the demon needed a new vessel, a new host. The house, with its dark secrets, had found one. In a desperate final effort, Marla reached for the wall, but as her fingers touched the paint, she realized with growing horror that the murals were alive. They were moving, shifting, beneath her touch, as though the house itself was rearranging the very fabric of reality. But it was too late. When the house finally fell silent, Marla stood up. She felt different. Something had changed. Her mind felt clouded, her thoughts slow and heavy. She looked at her reflection in the cracked mirror. Her eyes were wide, but there was something off about them. Something that didn't belong to her. She looked back at the murals, and for the first time she understood. The house had chosen her. It had taken her. And now she was part of it, a vessel for whatever had once been imprisoned. Clarissa, who had been watching from the door, her face pale, whispered, "What did you do, Marla? What did you release?" But Marla didn't answer. She didn't need to. The entity that had been freed had already taken over, and now it was in her. The house whispered in the shadows, calling her its own. Marla turned to the walls and smiled. "Host," she whispered softly, and the house breathed with her. Story number 10. Sam Weller had always been a practical man. At 33, he was the kind of guy who didn't believe in fairy tales or ghost stories. When he married Lila, his high school sweetheart, they'd built their lives together methodically. Lila's soft smile and kind heart were the perfect balance to his grounded nature. They had everything they needed, until the one thing they hadn't planned for came into their lives. A baby girl. When their daughter, Isla, came into their lives through adoption, it was nothing short of a miracle. Leila had struggled with infertility, and after years of trying, they were overjoyed to find that Isla's biological mother had chosen them. At long last, they were a family. To celebrate, Sam and Lila moved into a quiet, picturesque house on the edge of town. The home was everything they wanted: charming, peaceful, with a beautiful nursery ready for Isla's arrival. The walls were soft shades of pastel, and the room was filled with sunlight in the mornings, casting a warm glow over the crib. Everything about it felt perfect, or at least it did, at first. The first few weeks with Isla were blissful. She was a calm baby, content and easy to soothe. Lila doted on her, and Sam could hardly believe how lucky they were. But then, a few nights after they brought Isla home, something strange began to happen. It was around midnight, the house quiet except for the soft hum of the baby monitor. Sam was getting ready for bed when he heard it. Isla, cooing, laughing softly in her crib. Sam smiled. She was such a peaceful baby, always content in her little world. He turned to Lila, who was lying next to him in their bedroom, her face bathed in the soft glow of the nightlight. "She's cooing again," Sam whispered. Lila smiled, sleepily. "She's such a good baby." But then, just as Sam started to turn back to his side of the bed, he heard it again. A voice. It wasn't Isla's voice, though. It was a soft, muffled whisper, barely audible, coming through the baby monitor. Sam froze. He strained to listen. The voice was speaking in a language he couldn't understand, low and gentle, like someone whispering sweetly to the baby. He reached over and gently nudged Lila awake. "Did you hear that?" Sam asked, his voice shaking slightly. Lila blinked, confused, still half asleep. "What? Hear what?" "The voice," Sam whispered, "coming from the monitor." Lila sat up in bed, wide-eyed. "I didn't hear anything," but Sam knew what he had heard. He turned the monitor up, his heart pounding in his chest. There was no mistaking it. A voice, soft and soothing, was speaking to their daughter through the static. The voice seemed to say something, then pause as though waiting for a response. Sam listened closely, his mind racing. The voice said something that chilled him to the bone. "Isla, I'm your real sibling." Sam's skin went cold. He glanced over at Lila, who was now fully awake, her face pale. "What the hell is going on?" Sam muttered. They both stared at the baby monitor for a long moment, unable to look away. Isla was still cooing softly in her crib, oblivious to the conversation taking place in the walls. Sam sat up, his mind spinning. He was hearing things. He had to be. There was no way that voice was real, but deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The next morning, Sam did everything he could to reassure Lila. It was probably interference from another monitor, or some strange glitch in the system. We'll call the company and get it checked. But even as he said the words, he knew it didn't make sense. The voice didn't sound like a technical malfunction. It felt personal. Over the following days, the whispers returned, soft, fleeting, but always there. Sometimes Isla would giggle, cooing at nothing in particular, and then the voice would speak to her again. "Play with me, Isla. I'm waiting." Lila grew more and more unsettled, and Sam's confidence began to slip. One night, as he stood by the nursery door, he heard the voice again, clearer than ever before. "Isla, let me in." Sam's heart stopped. It was like the walls themselves were speaking to him. He couldn't ignore it anymore. Desperate for answers, he reached out to Dr. Ellery, the local historian and expert on the history of the town. Dr. Ellery was a quiet man, with a deep knowledge of the area's past, and Sam figured that if anyone knew about strange occurrences in the house, it would be him. When Sam explained the situation, Dr. Ellery's face grew somber. He sat back in his chair, tapping his fingers together thoughtfully. "You're not the first people to hear those voices," he said. "In fact, this house has a very dark history, a tragic one." Sam listened intently as Dr. Ellery spoke. The house, it seemed, was built on land that had a long, painful history. Decades ago, the original owners had hired a midwife to deliver their child, but the baby was stillborn. The midwife, devastated by the loss, had locked herself in the nursery, her grief overwhelming her. She died there, alone, before anyone could find her. Over time, the whispers began, soft at first and then louder until they became a permanent fixture in the walls of the nursery. The family who owned the house tried to sell it, but no one could ever stay there long enough. Eventually, the house fell into disrepair until it was sold to Sam and Lila. "Whoever that baby was," Dr. Ellery said quietly, "it never left. Its soul was never laid to rest. And now, it's calling to your daughter. It wants to be born again." Sam felt his blood run cold. "Born again?" Dr. Ellery nodded. "It believes Isla is its sibling, its twin. It's been trapped in those walls for so long, waiting for a way out." A chill crept over Sam as he stood in the doorway of the nursery, staring at Isla in her crib. The whispers had stopped for the moment, but Sam knew it wasn't over. The baby, no, the ghost of the baby, wanted to be born. And it wasn't going to stop until it got what it wanted. That night, Sam and Lila decided they couldn't stay in the house any longer. They packed quickly, gathered Isla in her bassinet, and left, not knowing where to go, but sure that they couldn't stay there. The house, with its dark history and its whispering walls, was no longer a home. It was a prison. But as they drove away with the headlights casting long shadows on the road ahead, they heard it again, the soft, innocent giggling of a baby from the back seat. Isla wasn't laughing. "Alone. Isla, play with me," the voice whispered. Sam's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter. He looked over at Lila, but her face was pale, her eyes wide with terror. The ghost wasn't done with them. The house had followed them. The whispers would never stop, and Isla, sweet Isla, would never be free. Have you ever heard something in the walls? Something that wasn't quite right? Don't miss out on this spine-chilling journey as Marla uncovers the horrifying truth lurking within the nursery's walls. Subscribe now to hear the rest of this heart-stopping story, and stay tuned for more tales of the supernatural.